Everybody. So we're going to talk today about the different theories on the origins of government and different theories of what government should do from my dad's beautiful backyard. So when we look at government and the origins of government, we can go back to, in the modern era, Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes was a political philosopher in the 1500s. And Hobbes said that man was born in a state of nature in which there was no government. And it was anarchy, really. In fact, if we want to quote Hobbes, Hobbes had said that life was poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Anarchy, really. So he said what people did was they entered into a contract with a king. He said it's sort of beginning of a social contract. And the terms of the contract would be that the king would protect you from invasion, so other countries or tribes wouldn't come up and destroy you. And the king would keep order to make sure your neighbors didn't do that. In return, you gave the king all of your rights. And so Hobbes would say, look, if you had a bad king, too bad, there's nothing you can do about it. You're just going to have to live with it until that king dies. Now, the Hobbes view of the world is a very grim view of the world. And so sometimes you'll hear people say that's a Hobbesian view. And when you hear that, that means that they're saying that you have a very grim view of the world. Well, about 100 years later, after the Glorious Revolution in England in 1688, another man comes along by the name of John Locke. John Locke is going to be very influential on American politics. He's going to be very influential on the Declaration of Independence. In fact, the Declaration of Independence written by Jefferson is almost pure John Locke. Locke had read Hobbes, and he said, yes, Hobbes is right, that we were born in a state of nature in which there was no government, that we entered into a contract with the king, and yes, the king's job was to keep order and protect you from invasion. But, Locke said, the king had one additional right, and that was to protect your natural rights. This comes out of the Enlightenment, that there were certain natural laws that affected gravity and everything else, and also affected people's social and political behavior. And Locke said among these natural rights were life, liberty, and property. And he said that the government was created to make sure those rights were protected, and that if your king was not protecting your rights, not only did you have the right to overthrow that government and replace it with one that would protect your rights, but you also had a duty to protect those rights, to overthrow that government. And so that's going to be influential on the U.S. experience during the American Revolution. Now, some other theories we'll just go through fairly quickly. The divine right theory. The divine right theory was the basis of a lot of European monarchies, that God had chosen certain people to rule over their fellow man. They had a hotline to God, and their power was absolute. And so you see divine right monarchies for a long time, until, starting with the British Glorious Revolution in 1688, where it starts to be declining. But all the way up into the 1790s, like in France, King Louis felt that God had placed him on there. So that's the divine right theory. Another theory is what we call the force theory. And the force theory suggests that we had somebody who was more powerful than everybody else, and they imposed their will on the weak. So like an alpha dog or, pride of lions, whoever the strongest, would impose their will on everybody else, who had the biggest army, whatever. And that's sort of a militaristic view of the origins of government. Another one is what we call the patriarchal or matriarchal theory, which says that government really grew up out of the extended family or clan or tribe. And you would see this in places like in African societies, where government would be based on familiarity of family. And so you might have a great-grandfather at the top, and then he'd be ruling through his sons, and then through their sons, all the way down toward the bottom. And that still partly exists today. You might go to Nigeria today and ask them, what are you? And they may not say Nigerian. They might say they're Igbo or Akpo. They relate to the family structure. And this was difficult for Europeans to comprehend. They of course, were ethnocentric and didn't understand these types of governments. And when they drew their colonial boundaries during the scramble for Africa, they overlapped a lot of these tribal authorities, and it still impacts Africa today of what they did. Another one is what we call the Marxist theory, named after Karl Marx with a K. And they believe that government was actually created by the rich. It's sometimes known as the superstructure of society, that government was created by the rich and was designed to make sure that the rich could stay rich. As you can imagine, Marx might come back today and go, well, I was right, because wealthy people are able to donate more money. There are more wealthy members in Congress. Laws tend to favor the wealthy. And so he would say they were right. And so when you think about Karl Marx, who's the founder of modern communism, he gets some things wrong, but he gets a lot of things right. It's one reason why you study Marx in economics, sociology, philosophy, history, political science, psychology. He's everywhere, and people debate him constantly. And then last but not least, there's the historical school, which believes that really it's all of these factors that put together modern government, whether it's the family, whether it's economic, according to Marx, whether it's militaristic, whether it was religion that had an impact. All of those had an impact on the beginnings of government. So if we look at what should government do, well, let's break that down into different groups. And we've got to be very careful about the terms we use, because they've changed over a period of time, constantly. So the first one are the anarchists. Now, anarchists had their heyday really in the late 1800s, where they blew up part of the Russian royal family. They also assassinated the Spanish prime minister, involved in a lot of riots. And anarchists assassinated William McKinley and brought Teddy Roosevelt into the White House, which drastically changed the view of the presidency. But anarchists believe that there should be no government. They don't like organization, because organization has rules, and any rules inhibit your personal liberty. And so government is the biggest organization with the most rules. Next up are the Libertarians. Now, there's a Libertarian Party in the United States. Many of them have just merged into the Republican Party, and you can see trends of this libertarianism in people like Rand Paul out of Kentucky. Greg Abbott, he's probably an evangelical libertarian. Those are out there. Libertarians believe in very, very limited government. They believe that primarily government's job should be to protect us from invasion and to keep order. So you would bring all the troops home to make sure you didn't get invaded, and you'd have some sort of police force. But they believe in the ultimate personal responsibility and personal behavior. In other words, they would argue, some libertarians argue that if you want to have cocaine, that's fine. If you want to carry an AR-15 down the street, that's fine, as long as you don't hurt anybody else. Now, the Libertarians have never been a major political force in the United States. They have garnered less than 0.5% of the vote when they run for presidential candidates. So many of them have just joined up to the Republican Party and have effectively shifted the Republican Party over to some of their beliefs. Now, the next two terms are pretty confusing: liberal and conservative. They're thrown out there and they don't mean a whole lot. If you were to go back to, say, 1795, a classical liberal would oppose big government. It would say the most for personal freedom. If you go look at the election of 1932, Herbert Hoover and FDR both claimed to be liberals in favor of a liberal democracy and what they call liberal capitalists. So the idea of liberal and conservative, for me, doesn't mean a whole lot, especially in the American political system, other than they tend to be sort of buzzwords. So let me give you some possible definitions of liberal and conservative, and they're not the greatest. If you don't like them, you can probably go look up some, probably can make some up on your own. So look at liberals. Liberals believe that government should stay out of your private life, but be involved in your economic life to regulate and protect you. Conservatives, in theory, just like liberals in theory, believe that government should stay out of your private life and stay out of your economic life. Now, the one reason you see liberals being different here is because in the 1800s, when you saw the rise of these really big businesses, they felt like, who's the only power that can counter these big businesses? And that would have been a bigger government. Another more philosophical definition of liberal and conservative is that liberals believe that, well, let's do conservatives first this time. Conservatives believe that most people, a majority of the time, not all people all the time, or not all people most of the time, but most people most of the time act out of their own self-interest. They do what's best for themselves or their family, what benefits them financially. Liberals believe, no, that most people most of the time, not all the people all the time again, act out of a sense of enlightened self-interest, that they'll do the right thing whether it benefits them financially or not. We call that enlightened self-interest because when you do something right, you still feel good about it. So there's some self-interest there. So I always tell my class, I said, think about it this way. If you went to Kroger and you bought a whole bunch of groceries and you noticed that Kroger overcharged you for some steaks by $30, what would you do? They'd go back, right? That's your economic self-interest. But what if you went to, say, Albertsons and you found out that they didn't charge you for your steaks? They undercharged you $30. Would you go back? Liberals would argue, yeah, most people would try to go back and pay it. Conservatives would say, no, most people would rationalize why they're going to keep the money, but they'd keep the money. Now that changes a little bit on the dynamics if you think about it. If you found a wallet that had $400 in cash in it, and it had the driver's license and phone number of the person, would you return it? Now, strangely enough, my students will say, yeah, I'd return it. But a lot of them would keep the money from Albertsons because they say, look, it's a big company. And I always say, well, I don't think the commandment says thou shalt not steal except from big companies. So these aren't real precise definitions, and people are not consistent, right? We know that. If we're consistent in one thing, it's our inconsistency. And then last but not least, we're going to talk about the Marxists again, Karl Marx. Now, and this will be socialism. And this is a buzzword that you hear all the time nowadays, socialism. Well, socialism in its most basic form is government intervention in the economy. And there are primarily two types of socialists. There are the democratic socialists that you hear people like Bernie Sanders say they are. And then there are the Marxists, which would have gone back to maybe North Korea today, the old Chinese government. Those would be the Marxists. Now, democratic socialists believe that the government should own the industries vital to the nation. That could be the healthcare industry, that could be the airlines, could be the power industry, the communication industry, some defense industries. But everything else should be left open to the free market. Marxists believe that the government should own all the means of protections, all the factories, and tell the factories what to produce. This is sometimes known as a command economy, where in the United States we operate under what a market economy. The market decides. Now, before you fall into the whole socialism horrible thing, remember, we have a lot of socialism in the United States. Social Security is socialism. In Texas, we have the county healthcare system that provides healthcare for those who cannot pay. That's a socialist idea. Roads are socialism. And so most successful economies are blends of capitalism and socialism. In Europe, they lean more toward the socialist side. And in the United States, we lean more toward the capitalist side. And both sides seem to find pros and cons in both of those systems. So that's that basic lecture, some basic terms we're going to get to. Next time, I'm going to give you some definitions, or we're going to start talking about how we can spread government out. How do we spread governmental power out? And that's what we'll do next time.